Hello and welcome to a very special um stream, which is number 100. I can't believe I'm not done with this stupid book, which isn't stupid at all. It's great, but anyway, it's taken me a long time, and here I am with day 100, page 724. We were talking about some random guy named Tom Shanahan, who, what's his deal? He's really not that famous. He's just like this like democratic organizer guy with a lot of money, and we talked about his history and how he basically like he was grinding at this bank that wasn't that big of a deal, and then the bank became a big deal because of the way the government stuff worked out with banks in the Great Depression. So his bank, called Federation, is like a big deal, and this Tom Shanahan guy, we're just still learning about him, and it's in the context of like Robert Moses has the whole Triborough Authority situation, which is super private. He doesn't have to tell anyone what his financial business is. So he's given out handouts to all these politicians, and he's doing it through insurance. Like he's being like, yo, like if you're on the board of this one insurance thing, then we'll totally use your company for insurance, and we're never going to file any claims. It's going to be like just truly just a deposit in your account. Okay, anyway, theoretically, Moscow said. Who's Moscow? I don't know. And the meaning behind that word was echoed by others who came in contact with Tom Shanahan. For even insiders who took the relationship of money and politics as a matter of course were taken aback by Shanahan's greed. We all knew what Shanahan was, Monroe Goldwater said, the wrinkles of his aged face forming a pattern of disgust at the recollection. If little publicity attended Shanahan's rise in banking, less attended his rise in politics. For years, there was scarcely a mention of his name in political stories in New York newspapers. There is no mention at all in the supposedly definitive history of Tammany Hall. But Shanahan was, for more than a decade, Tammany's money man, the individual who, more than any other, greased the wheels of the machine. He was the hub of political payoffs and influence peddling in New York, the center of all those elements in the city's government that lay hidden and festering beneath the facade. And for most of that time, he was Robert Moses' closest associate in the government. In a machine oiled by money, the influence of the money man was, of course, enormous. In a machine that danced to the jingle of coins, Shanahan had a large say in calling the tune. Well, that was a nice little sentence. And Moses made sure that the tune was his tune. The insurance premiums to the broker friend of Shanahan's were $27,000 per year, but they were a minor item in the list of Triborough fees parceled out to Shanahan. The fees to Shanahan's bank for banking services, fees as paying agent for Triborough bonds, for example, which required little work and which other banks would have liked to have, but which other banks were not allowed to bid for, amounted to tens of thousands of dollars on a single issue of Triborough bonds. But these were minor items too, for the payoffs that really mattered in the Moses-Shanahan relationship were figured not in thousands of dollars, but in millions. On Moses' order, in 1948, the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority deposited in the Federation Bank and Trust Company, which at the time had deposits of only $35 million, $15 million, thereby increasing the bank's capital assets by 40% at a single stroke. This money was placed in accounts on which Federation paid no interest, so that the bank had its use to lend out and earn interest without paying a cent on it. And it was left in these accounts for the entire decade that Shanahan remained in power, so that the bank had its use for 10 years. During the 50s, on Moses' order, Triborough shipped to Federation $48,900,000 in authority-owned investment securities, in violation of every prudent business principle because, at the time he did so, the bank didn't have enough total resources sufficient to cover that amount if the securities were lost, and left them there, allowing the bank the advantages that accrued from their possession for years. Moses placed at Shanahan's disposal not only his money, but his power, which Shanahan used to make more money. Hello, happy 100. Yeah, sorry, no party, just the normal party stuff. Coffee, I don't know. That's all I got. We're reading about Tom Shanahan, who's this rich banker who's kind of craven, who's getting paid off by Robert Moses. There's a little... Sorry, I got a bug. Okay, during his first 5 years as Housing Authority Vice Chairman, Shanahan, with the help of two Moses men on the five-member authority, Chairman Philip J. Cruz and architect William Wilson, dispensed authority contracts as he wished. When Wagner became mayor in 1954, however, he wanted the authority under his control. Naming Moscow executive director, and I can't remember who Moscow is again. I think he might have just been like one of those guys who was like, this guy was influential. Yeah, I don't know who Moscow is. Don't know. Mystery man. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, so Moscow is the director of the housing authority. He directed him to inform Cruz, whose term was expiring, that he would be reappointed only on his solemn promise to give his loyalties henceforth to the mayor instead of Moses. And Moscow dryly relates, Cruz made his divorce. Knowing Shanahan, the Wagner High Command, while friendly to the banker, was far from confident that all the kickbacks he accepted as contributions to the Democratic Party were actually reaching the party's coffers. Quote, that was one of the things they put me in to do. Quite simply, to take control of the assigning of architects away from Shanahan, Moscow says. Because he could act, however, the banker made a request that would increase rather than decrease his power for a personal executive assistant. Suspicious that Shanahan wanted such a personal representative primarily as a bagman, an intermediary who could collect the kickbacks and keep the banker's hands clean, Moscow objected to the appointment and was backed by Cruz and the authorities' two non-Moses members. Shanahan, even more florid than usual, his eyes glaring coldly from behind the steel-rimmed glasses, stalked out of the boardroom and said he would not return until his request was granted, but for months the authorities stood firm. Authority members had long dreaded the possibility of an expose by some red-hunting newspaper of the fact that some authority social workers had once, during the idealistic 30s, belonged, even if only briefly, to some organization labeled as a communist front. Early in 1957, with Shanahan's boycott still a failure, Moses man Wilson raised the question of the vice chairman's executive assistant again. Recalls Moscow. It was in a meeting of the authority. The 5 members of the authority were there, me and the assistant to the chairman, and Wilson, and in so many words, quote, I have a message for you from Mr. Moses. You give Tom what he wants, or we'll turn the Daily News loose on you. You have 10 days. Tom got what he wanted, and for another 2 years, he continued to exercise considerable control over the authority and to collect campaign contributions from its contractors. Naming Shanahan vice chairman of the mayor's slum clearance committee, Moses virtually delegated him absolute power over certain of its projects. Monroe Goldwater found this out when he was retained as attorney by a group of real estate men who wanted to sponsor one. Moses put it on Shanahan, the attorney recalls. Attorney and authority, I keep reading wrong. He says, you know I can't do everything myself. I have to let Tom get some of the jobs. This is Tom's job. Go see him. When Goldwater approached the banker, however, Shanahan reacted as the attorney had suspected he would. Shanahan said, well, I don't know about this. I said, don't you think it's your job to take the low bidder to consider the rate of return they want and the rate of interest they will have to pay and the quality of the men involved? He said, well, there can be a slight variation. I said, look, cut out the crap with me, Tom. Are you committed to somebody? He said, yes, because he always is, because he is slimy and corrupt. I said, well, I'm going to make an issue of this with Moses. I'll tell you this right now. Without even knowing what rate of return the other people want, my people will give it to you at 0.5% less. I went to see Moses, but he said, I can't do this with Tom. Tom is committed to these people. And Moses refused to intervene. Thus, supported by Moses, Shanahan used his vice chairmanship as a lever to force prospective slum clearance sponsors to do business with him. A part of my deal was that I had to do my banking at Shanahan's bank. One was to relate. Federation's assets, already on the climb, began to climb faster. In 1948, the year in which its president was appointed to the Slum Clearance Committee, they were $35 million. In 1959, the year in which he resigned from the post, they were almost $200 million, and Shanahan's personal holdings in Federation stock were worth $20 million. Moses put his vast resources of money and power at Shanahan's disposal. Shanahan put his vast reserves of influence at Moses's. The banker was interested in who got housing authority and urban renewal contracts, unconcerned with the aims and principles of government. He wasn't interested in where housing authority and urban renewal projects were located, why they were located there, or how they were built, the factors that Moses was interested in. The banker ran the housing authority for Moses. The housing authority projects built were the projects Moses wanted built, or the sites on the sites where Moses wanted them built to the specifications Moses desired. In 1953, when Shanahan's term expired, Moses wrote impellatory. I can't remember who that is, but we knew it. Oh, impellatory is the mayor. I think that was the mayor. Moses wrote impellatory. It is of the utmost importance that Tom be reappointed. It was to him. The influence Shanahan exercised for Moses was not limited to housing or urban renewal. Time and time again, on highway proposals by Moses on which the city's officials were divided, the banker's power helped tip the scales in Moses' favor. In dealing with DeSapio and Shanahan and Goldwater and Rosenman and Steingut and Rowe and Perouse, those are all a bunch of influential guys, Moses was, as always, going straight to the top. Charles F. Rodriguez, representing vacationing Bronx Borough President James J. Lyons on the Board of Estimate during the controversy over Moses's proposal to construct Shea Stadium, had received, that was a really blast from the past. I remember that. Remember Shea Stadium? That was like a paragraph a while ago. Anyway, so this random guy, Charles Rodriguez, had received no instructions on the matter and believing that the city had more pressing uses for the $21 million involved, was considering voting against it when the telephone in his office rang. And the voice on the other end of the line wasn't that of his boss, but of his boss's boss. I think if Jim was here, he'd go along, Charles Buckley said gently. You do it, and if there's any question, ask Jim to see me. Rodriguez did it, and there was never any question. As a state senator would admit privately, describing Moses's methods in Albany, he wouldn't bother with us at all. He went right to the leaders. As old-time Tammany ward bosses had distributed Christmas baskets filled with turkeys and sugar plums in decades past, Robert Moses distributed Christmas baskets now, but he distributed them not to voters and not, at least not primarily, to the men the voters had elected to office, but to the men who controlled the men the voters had elected to office, many of the most powerful men in the city and state. His ward, his district, was the uppermost precincts of politics. There's only one way to hold a district, explained George Washington Plunkett, who held his for 30 years. You must study human nature and act according. Moses studied human nature in his district and acted according. His constituents, the DeSapios and Shanahans and Steinguts, wanted the rich Christmas baskets of honest graft. Moses handed them baskets. Using the vast wealth of the public authorities, he made himself the ward boss of the highest precincts, bankroller of the inner circle, dancing master of the 400 of politics. And he held his district for 30 years. Doling out sugar plums to such men gave him power over them in other ways too. As Wagner, in a very private talk in 1961, referred to in the introduction, tried to explain to Paul R. Scrivane. The mayor was personally fond of Scrivane, a younger man he had taken under his wing years before and guided through the political thickets and just a year earlier into the city council presidency. Informing him that he would be city liaison to Moses's World Fair, the mayor leaned toward him and said earnestly, Paul, my experience with Moses has taught me one lesson, and I'll tell it to you. I would never let him do anything for me in any way, shape, or form. I'd never ask him or permit him to do anything of a personal nature for me because, and I've seen it time and time again, a day will come when Bob will reach back in his file and throw this in your face, quietly, if that will make you go along with him, publicly otherwise. And if he has to, he will destroy you with it. Scrivane admired, idolized, would scarcely be too strong a word, Moses. He was loath to believe Wagner's warning. But, he recalls, during a series of battles in the Fair Executive Committee, I saw it happen time and time again. Bob Moses had these files. On at least 20 separate occasions when we were on the same side, I would say about someone, I don't think he'll go along. And Bob would say, well, goddammit, he'd better go along. If he doesn't go along, I'll destroy the son of a bitch. And he'd call for a file and he would begin to quote chapter and verse. And sure enough, when the vote came, the fellow would go along. No one could dwell in the inner circles of New York politics without knowing about Moses's files, the dossiers that he compiled on the men with whom he had to deal. Their experience was so open a secret that Times reporter Joseph C. Ingraham, a personal friend of Moses's, assigned by an editor to investigate the financial affairs of a Tammany borough president, knew exactly where to start looking. He telephoned Moses and asked for the file on the borough president, and there inside it, documented in photos stated, complete down to deeds and incorporation certificates, the reporter found the records of real estate transactions in which the borough president had engaged. Transaction based on his foreknowledge, acquired through his official position on the routes of certain Moses-built highways. Politicians who had accepted favors from Moses knew that the documentation of those favors was in his dossiers, and they knew that Moses would use that documentation to destroy them if they ever refused to go along with his wishes. They had accepted a favor from him perhaps once, he had a hold over them forever. A politician who had never accepted a favor from Moses knew that this did not grant him immunity from such attack. He knew that Moses' bloodhounds were sniffing, always sniffing around City Hall and the files in the municipal building, and he could be sure that up at Randall's Island there was a file with his name on it, and who knew what might be in it? Man, as Willie Stark put it in All the King's Men, is born in sin and dies in corruption. Or in the words of Jack Lutsky, who during his quarter of a century in City Hall earned a reputation as a fearless and honest man, is there anyone who, sometime in his life, hasn't done something he's ashamed of? Well, you always had the feeling that Moses knew about that something, and he had proof of it in those files of his, and that if he needed to, he would use it. Politicians knew what use Moses could make of his dossiers. They had seen him give newspapers leaks or issue statements that dredged up for public view and turned into blaring headlines the dark secrets of men's past. It was not just the force of greed that Robert Moses used in bending men to his will. In some cases, it was also the force of fear. If you stayed on his team, moreover, he would take care of you even after you were too old to play, for his own purposes, of course. He would take care of you until you died. William Wilson was, to Warren Moscow, only Moses' stooge, but he was a well-paid stooge. Wagner kicked him off the Housing Authority in 1954 when he was 73 years old. Moses promptly supplanted his city retirement benefits with a $10,000 per year authority consultantship. When Edmund Salmon was forced out of the $15,000 City Planning Commission chairmanship that Moses had obtained for him, Moses asked Brooklyn Borough President John Cashmore to give him a job and a $15,000 salary on his personal staff. Thanks, Thanks, Mr. Cashmore, for the $15K. I would love some of that, Mr. Cashmore. That's almost as good as, what was the army guy that was like, whoa, there was a really good name I think yesterday, wasn't there like an army general whose name was like Loser? It was like always losing. General Loser. There was an army general, General Loser. Okay. Anyway. There was no job open, Cashmore said. Then make a new job, was Moses' reply. A new job was made. Paul Scrivane remembers running for the 1965 Democratic nomination for mayor after Wagner retired, and losing and waking up on the morning after the primary wondering what he was going to do with the rest of his life. Bob had 3 jobs lined up for me, he says. And these were not just ordinary jobs. Moses offered Scrivane his choice of the presidency of a consulting engineering firm whose president had just died, a full, lucrative partnership in another engineering firm, and he had another authority in mind, and I could be chairman and write my own ticket. Says Scrivane, Bob always took care of people who cooperated with him. If you cooperated. If you tried even occasionally not to cooperate, if you dropped off the team, if ever you exercised your responsibility to the public rather than your responsibility to Robert Moses, you were out in the cold until you died. There would be no consulting jobs, no authority make work. And if the rumors were true, when the state retirement board met to certify your pension, it would somehow turn out to be less, far less than you had believed you were entitled to. As Lazarus put it, he didn't want anyone who had been on the inside with him to talk about the way he operated. This way, he was buying their silence to the grave. Moses demanded allegiance only in the areas he had staked out for his own, but that allegiance had, in those areas, to be total. And with most of his constituents, it was. He not only held his district, he controlled it absolutely. He was in his fields the boss of the bosses. He did not extend his field of force only over individuals, of course. One cannot dip a toe in the water of New York politics without sensing, moving somewhere deep beneath the surface, the presence of an enormous force, a power unseen but immense, the power of banks. Banks control the dispensing of huge amounts of insurance, and they can dispense it to politicians. Their activities generate immense amounts of legal work, and they can dispense the least onerous and most lucrative aspects of that work, local real estate closings, for example, to politicians. They can give politicians access to the inside financial information on which fortunes are made by electing them to their boards of directors. And they can give them fortunes more directly by giving them blocks of their own stock at favorable prices, or more directly still, by giving them unsecured loans, which allow them to make investments without the inconvenience or risk of using their own money. And by giving them those loans at interest rates so favorable that the investments can hardly help resulting in a profit. They can give politicians loans of a size that make them rich beyond their dreams. The acceptance of these and other favors puts politicians in the bank's debt. Banks are very good at collecting debts. They collect them with interest, and they collect politicians' debts with interest, the public interest. Decade after decade, what banks wanted from Albany or City Hall, banks got. Some political analysts speak of the influence of New York's banks as influence exerted almost entirely on the Republican Party. But it's not only Republicans who are interested in money. The power of the great banks of New York crosses party as well as county lines. Within the overall political structure of New York, city and state, it is all pervasive and immense. And Moses enlisted it behind his aims. Banks have one aim, making money. Moses made sure their aim and his coincided. He made sure the banks would make money, quick money, easy money, safe money from his public works. Revenue bonds, the key to his authority's existence and power, were the key to the alliance. Banks needed authority bonds, forbidden by federal law from putting the money deposited with them by the public into all but the very safest investments, the very best of what bankers call good, high-grade paper, barred specifically from purchasing corporate stock, and by inference reinforced by continuous evaluation of their investment portfolios by government regulatory overseers, from purchasing any bonds and notes except those of the most solid corporations, of governments, and of public authorities. 4 years of investment-stifling war had left them loaded with cash, impatient to put it to work, earning more cash, and with a drastically insufficient supply of good high-grade paper into which to put it. Jack Madigan, who had spent weeks trying to peddle Henry Hudson bridge bonds around Wall Street in 1936, was astonished when previously aloof bank presidents began inviting him to lunch in their private dining rooms in 1946, until one, Stuart Becker, the president of the Bank of Manhattan, casually remarked over dessert, "You know, Jack, you've got more money than good uses for it." Then he understood. Returning from Becker's table, he told Moses that the banker was asking to be allowed to buy as much as possible of the next Triborough bond issue, and the bartender's son added that he would never have to go hat in hand to bankers again. From now on, bankers would come to him. "It's just supply and demand," he would explain simply. The demand for Triborough's bonds was far greater than the supply. Of all possible investments legal for banks, moreover, public authority bonds were the most desirable. In selecting investments, bankers had 3 aims: to keep their money safe, to make as much money as possible with it, and to keep the money they made. Keeping money meant, in post-war America, tax exemption. Corporate bonds, yes, we're talking about, well, it's really, this chapter's it started out being about this one guy that was a banker, and now it's just kind of about, like, I don't know. It's just more about Moses being corrupt. Basically, they're like really good at it's in like the 40s and 50s. They got really into paying off banks and politicians and other sorts of politically influential people. So, corporate bonds were dependent upon corporate profits, so much more risky than bridge tolls. Their yield was higher. In 1968, 8% to about 5%, but banks had to pay half of their profits, 52%, later 48%, to the government in taxes. So their yield from a corporate bond would, in terms of money kept, be only about 4%. So tax-exempt authority bonds had both greater safety and a higher return than corporate bonds. U.S. government bonds were as safe as authority bonds, their yield as high, but that yield was subject to state and local taxes. Their net yield was lower. State and municipal bonds, exempt from taxes, had net yields about the same as authority bonds. But in Wall Street's view, they were not as safe since state and municipalities always seemed to be in financial difficulties and were continually being forced to go to the voters for permission to raise taxes. And who could predict what voters would do? Authorities, on the other hand, grew continually more prosperous from revenues guaranteed by covenants that were sacred contracts, safe from public whim or will. During the first post-war quarter century, New York City's bonds fluctuated fairly substantially in the ratings they were given for safety. Triboroughs held steady year after year at AAA, the highest rating given. Ask New York bankers why they are so eager to buy public authority bonds, and they begin, as does Dwayne Saunders, vice president of the investment division of the Chemical Bank, by speaking sanctimoniously of our feeling of responsibility to the community by financing projects that will benefit it. But the longer one talks to bankers, the less the talk is of responsibility and the more it dwells on the more mundane considerations. A Triborough bond is very, very high quality instrument, Saunders says. And they're paying, say, 540, which is almost 11%. There are corporates out there, but no government stuff. You're always matching yield against safety in this business. Any portfolio manager will try within his limits to maximize his yields. He becomes very, very interested in yield, and authority bonds are the highest yielding of any investment security after tax. Higher yielding than any other safe investment, higher yielding, in fact, than the most risky investments, higher yielding even than the riskiest of investments, personal loans. A public authority bond is simply the best investment a bank can make, by far. Of all public authority bonds, moreover, none were more desirable to banks than Triboroughs, by design. Moses wanted banks to be so anxious to purchase Triborough bonds that they would use all their immense power to force elected officials to give his public works proposals the approval that would result in their issuance. So although the safety of the bank's money was already amply assured by Triborough's current earnings, so great that each year the authority collected far more money than it spent, by the irrevocable covenants guaranteeing that tolls could never be removed without the bondholder's consent, and by Triborough's monopoly, also irrevocable, that guaranteed them that if any future intracity water crossing were built, if any future intracity water crossing were built, they would share in its tolls too. Moses provided them with additional assurances. He maintained huge cash reserves. Fantastic, says Jackson Phillips, director of municipal research for Dun and Bradstreet. The last time I looked, they had 10 years interest on reserve. And when he floated the Verrazano bonds, he agreed to lay aside, in addition to the existing reserves, 15%, $45 million, of the cash he received for the new bond issue, and not touch it until the bridge was open and operating 5 years later. Purchasers of the Verrazano bonds could be all but certain that they could collect their interest every year, even if the bridge never collected a single toll. Small wonder that Phillips says, Triboroughs are just about the best bonds there are. Wall Streeters may believe that any investment is a bet, but Robert Moses was certainly running the safest game in town. Okay, I'm going to do one more paragraph, I think. It looks like it's going to be a few more pages of bank stuff. But actually, this is... Okay, never mind. The bank stuff is done soon. I like banks, but you know how I feel about the numbers chapters. When it's just chapters of and then we got money from this place. And then we got this much money from this place. I really just... Those test me. But it looks like this is not going to be so bad. An additional margin of safety, moreover, was provided by Moses' reputation. Moses never hesitated to give Wall Street the impression that he would go all out to protect their interests. Phillips says, we all knew, says a banker, that Moses would fight for his bondholders. During the previous 22 years of existence, the State Power Authority had never been able to find interest, had never been able to interest the street in its capital S street. So I'm assuming Wall Street he's calling the street. That's kind of chic. Okay, so the power authority had never been able to interest the street in even small proposed bond offerings. In 1954, Moses was named its chairman, and he offered for sale an issue of more than $1 billion, the largest revenue bond offering in history. There was some caution, Phillips recalls, but there was the feeling, look, Moses is doing this. The issue sold out in 4 days. Holders of Port Authority bonds were perturbed, although without cause, when in 1960, New York and New Jersey legislatures teamed up to force it to use its surplus revenues to take over the deficit-ridden Hudson and Manhattan tubes. But holders of Triborough bonds had no such worries. Triborough's annual surpluses may have been huge, more than $20 million per year and climbing, but Moses made sure that every cent was committed to future revenue, not deficit-producing projects. Wall Street loved him for this, Phillips says, and Wall Street knew Moses had the power to make these commitments stick. The Municipal Forum of New York is a group of extremely conservative municipal finance and bond analysts who generally accord guests no more than perfunctory applause. When Robert Moses appeared before the forum, its members, those hard-eyed men of finance, stood as one for an ovation. Moses offered bankers more than safety. A high return on their money was already assured in abundance by the bond's tax-exempt status, but Moses provided bankers with a still higher return. The interest rates on the bonds were higher than what they needed to be to attract buyers, so much higher that over the course of a single bond issue, the one floated to finance the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, bondholders would receive the almost incredible amount of $40 million more than they would have settled for. And favored bankers didn't have to wait for years to make money on Moses's bonds. He made it possible for them to make money in a single day. Banks made quick profits on bonds through underwriting, the procedure in which they agree to purchase profits from the issuing agency in the hope of reselling at a profit those that they can't afford to keep themselves. In the case of Triborough's bonds, of course, hope was an inaccurate term. No matter what the state of the market, every post-war Triborough bond issue was sold out, with many buyers still clamoring for them within 24 hours after the underwriting banks offered them for sale. In the case of Triborough's bonds, therefore, the underwriters risk the possibility that they may not be able to sell the bonds, which is the rationale for the profits underwriters are allowed to make, was negligible. And Moses made sure that the underwriters' profits would be huge. He allowed the Verrazano Underwriting Syndicate, for example, to purchase $300 million worth of bonds from Triborough for just $295,760,851. I wonder if the little, did that $1 did that matter? Since these bonds were sold on the same day they were issued for $300,570,851. The syndicate reaped a one-day profit of almost $5 million. Okay, I think I'm going to pause there. See you later.